So it's my great pleasure to introduce the Society's archivists. So Philip Toms, a name, a face and a voice familiar to all of you, I'm sure, and indeed his writings in the journal equally familiar. And of course, he's the person who looks after our archive in Manor Farmhouse, which is also a commendable service he gives to the Society. So without more ado, over to you, please, Philip, for your hotly awaited talk, Ruislip in the 1920s.
Well, I hope it won't be too disappointing. Anyway, hello, everyone. Nice to see so many of you. Just like to explain that I came to this topic because it occurred to me a few years ago that the 1920s don't get much coverage in histories of our area. There's usually a passing reference to them before writers go on to say, or perhaps infer, that it was the 1930s when things really started to change. Ian Tate, for example, in his talk reprinted in our current journal, said it was the early 30s when development really started in Ruislip, and before that, it remained quite a sleepy little village. Now, I wondered if these authors were right in suggesting that nothing much happened in the 20s, because surely something of note must have occurred during those 10 years. And so about 2 years ago, I set out to find what had been happening in this sleepy little village, unaware, of course, that COVID-19 would put a brake on how much I could get done this year before tonight's meeting. Now, I could keep this very short by saying that I found that not a lot did happen during these years, and therefore that brings an end to my talk and roll on the quiz. But that isn't true. So, although I haven't been able to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, I do hope to show that the 1920s were an important period in the history of Ruislip and the wider Ruislip Northwood Urban District Council area. For although I'm concentrating on Ruislip, I'll be including bits and pieces about Northwood and Eastcote too. So let's go back in time 100 years. In fact, a little more, because this map from 1916 is the closest to 1920 that I can find. And as 1916 was bang in the middle of the war, I imagine that not a lot would have changed during the next 4 years. Now this map shows that Risip seemed to have two centres in those days, located on the map at Ruislip and King's End, and that they were beginning to be more joined up with roads under construction. Manor Road, King Edward's Road, and Church Avenue. And that additional roads were being established towards Windmill Hill, Manor Way, and Windmill Way, which were sites for housing built by Ruislip Manor Cottage Society. Ruislip at this time was indeed a sparsely populated village. And as you can see, it was encircled by farms and fields. Statistics for 1920 show that oats, wheat, barley and mangold were the principal crops, and that in the UDC area, there were no fewer than 156 horses, 727 head of cattle, 555 sheep, and believe it or not, 247 pigs. Now the population had just lived through 4 years of war. The first anniversary of the armistice had been celebrated by a victory dance, and over 150 ex-servicemen had been treated to a Christmas dinner at the George Hotel. Many, of course, didn't come back, as witnessed by wooden crosses, stones, and even aeroplane wings and propellers in St. Martin's churchyard. for with the exception of a small wooden shrine erected during the war at Eastcote, which is now in St. Lawrence's Church, it was in the 1920s that our war memorials were erected. The first of these was unveiled at Ruislip Common in January 1920. As you can see, it recorded not only the 8 men who had lost their lives, but also those who had served in the war. The 61 names show very clearly how the war had affected families, for the list includes 3 Berts, 8 Ives, 3 Wests, 3 Brays, 3 Woodmans, 7 Lavenders, and 4 Wallaces. Ruislip's memorial was located in St. Martin's graveyard overlooking the war graves. It was dedicated by the Bishop of London on the 2nd of April 1920, when some 600 people attended, including a large contingent from the RAF and their band. The Society has 3 postcards showing Remembrance Day 2 years later. The first of these shows a procession to the memorial, and I like to think that there might have been a similar scene when it was unveiled. And the other 2 postcards show the silence and the last post. Now, Northwoods Memorial was erected at the junction of Green Lane and Maxwell Road and unveiled in February 1921. The 102 names recorded on it were collected over time, and in part through an appeal in the local newspaper. As you can see, a large crowd had gathered for the ceremony, and a local paper reported that it was some 4,000 to 5,000 people strong on that day. If it was that large, I think that's quite remarkable, because it's almost half the whole population of the area at the time. Anyway, Northwoods Memorial was closely followed by EASTCOTE, which was unveiled by Sidney Peel, the MP for Uxbridge, in June the same year. It formed an island site at the junction of Bridle Road and Field End Road, which was unfortunate because by 1929, both roads were being used by heavy motor traffic, and a vehicle hit and dislodged it some 4 inches on its plinth. And I like to think of this inspector as the man from the ministry who had previously been sent to see what the damage was. Well, the outcome was that, as you can see, it was taken away for repair, and that took several months, and then it was put back at the end of 1929, by which time the council were negotiating the purchase of the site where it sits today. We now need to return to our timeline and to Ruislip, for it had another memorial that most of the residents wouldn't have been able to see, but that they would hear. St. Martin's Church bells had fallen silent in 1912, when 3 of them cracked, leaving the other 5 unusable. They were recast and rehung at the end of 1922 in memory of the 34 men of the parish who had fallen in the war. Now, Northwood too had 2 memorials, for in 1919 it had been decided that a war memorial hospital would be opened, and that it would be based on the former VAD hospital in St. John's Presbyterian Church in Hallowell Road. All its equipment and surplus funds were transferred to the new enterprise, and in 1920 its McAlpine ward, which was a 70-foot-long temporary building, was opened as a temporary cottage hospital. And this was replaced when the permanent hospital in Pinner Road was opened in December 1924. And inside this permanent hospital, across the main corridor, is this beam in memory of those who fell in the war. And also inside is a plaque showing who the founders were. So these were the principal memorials erected in the 1920s, but we shouldn't move on before mentioning Edward George Honey, who was the Australian journalist who was the creator of the 2-minute silence. He died at Mount Vernon Hospital from TB and was buried in an unmarked grave at Northwoods Cemetery. And at the close of the decade, thought was being given to providing something more fitting. And I think we have that today. Hope you've all had a chance to read the words there. Now this picture shows a bungalow being built at Ruislip Common by the architect Maurice Adams. One of its main features was that its semicircular design didn't rely on support from sidewalls or beams, and the roof was constructed from reinforced concrete. And this was one response to the need for housing in the aftermath of the war and the homes fit for heroes promised by Lloyd George. Quite where it was located and what happened to it, I'm afraid I don't know. Because the UDC area experienced something of a housing boom in the 20s. In 1921, there were only about 1,900 houses, but by 1929, this had risen to 3,300, which was an increase of just over 800 in just 8 years. Now, one set of builders was the Risip Manor Cottage Society. This had been formed in 1911 with the aim of building houses for lower income families to rent. Another aim was for them to be laid out along garden suburb lines. Before the war, it had built in Manor Way and Windville Way, those that we highlighted on an earlier map, together with 3 houses in Parkway, which is sited approximately above where the map shows Risip Station. Further developments by the society were halted by the war, so it wasn't until the 20s that it built new houses. These were in Green Walk and Manor Close in Ruislip, Chestnut Avenue in Northwood, and 4th Street on the corner of Coatesford Close in Eastcote. These houses in Green Walk show the high-pitched roofs characteristic of the society's houses at this time. And if you would like to learn more about the history of the society and its houses, I can highly recommend Eileen's book, marking its first 100 years. Another main source of housing was the UDC itself. For the housing crisis under Homes Fit for Heroes pledge led to a nationwide system of council housing. Christopher Addison, after whom Addison Way in Northwood is named, was appointed Britain's first Minister of Health, and he introduced the Housing Act, under which local authorities were charged with building houses for working classes. Their blueprint was set out in the Tudor Walters Report of 1918, which set the minimum standards to which they should be built and the facilities that they should have. They were to be built at low densities, with front and rear gardens and along garden suburb lines. And house plans were provided too. Now, although there was something of a stop-start approach to social housing throughout the 20s, the UDC had built 490 by the end of the decade, and this is where they were built. Hope you can all read that. And in the Ruislip section, you will see mention of St. Martin's Lane. If anyone can tell me where St. Martin's Lane was, I'd be very grateful to know. It doesn't seem to exist anymore, so I haven't been able to work it out. Anyway, getting back to these houses, a number of house plans known as A, B, B2, etc. were used, and a Plan B house was described in the local paper as having a roomy parlour fitted with a gas fireplace, a kitchen cum living room that had a combination cooker and stove together with a large dresser and cupboard. The scullery had a sink and drying board together with a copper, a gas rig for cooking and a shelf for pans. There was also a larder and a place to keep coal. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, 2 having fireplaces, a bathroom with a heated linen cupboard, and a box room for lumber. Hot and cold water was available in the scullery and bathroom, and gas was laid on to all the rooms. Nearly all these council houses were built by Harry Neal Limited, which was based in Northwood. The company also built Northwood Gatehill Estate. This was started in the early 20s at a time when Northwood was becoming one of the fastest growing suburban districts of London, an area for living in the country, yet within easy reach of town. The estate was aimed at a superior section of the market, and prospective clients were enticed with marketing that expanded that there were no fewer than 4 golf links adjacent, plus good tennis facilities, and also good hunting with the old Berkeley Hunt. Houses could be designed and erected in accordance with the purchaser's requirements, subject to plans being approved, and there would be no more than 3 houses erected to the acre. So this marked a break from the standardisation along Garden City lines that we have seen with the social housing erected through the UDC. And all told, some 300 houses were built on the estate, and they ranged in price from £1,000 to £20,000. In Ruislip, the Windville Hill Estate was developed from the mid-20s. It covered about 46 acres and effectively joined Ruislip and EASTCOTE together. And whereas the housing density at the Gatehill Estate was a maximum of 3 to the acre, here at Windville Hill, it was up to 10. So they were smaller, cheaper houses to buy than in Northwood, although the appeal to the potential home buyer remained similar, ranging from the romantic idea of a windmill having once stood on its high commanding position, to the magnificent panoramic views of the beautiful surrounding district that could be gained. And alongside convenient access from all parts of London, there would be the charms of the noted oldie-worldy village of Risip close by. At more or less the same time, the Eastcote End Park Estate was being developed by Telling Brothers. It was on land originally sold by Ralph Hawtrey Dean of Eastcote House to the UDC for housing development, but the council then sold it on to Telling Brothers. Telling Brothers developed some 50 houses in Morford Way and Morford Close, and the estate also included a row of 15 shops, known as Field End Parade, and a community centre, which later became the Ideal Cinema. With the house building came estate offices and tradesmen, and of course those attracted to come to live here. But according to a humorous verse in Punch magazine, some approached their first journey here with some trepidation. I never heard of Ruislip. I never saw its name till underground advertisement had brought it into fame. I've never been to Ruislip. I never yet have heard the true pronunciation of so singular a word. I'd like to go to Ruislip. I'd like to feast my eyes on scenes of sylvan beauty that the posters advertise. But though I try to view the spot, while I am in the dark about its name, I dare not face the booking office clerk. Suppose I ventured Ruislip, and in answer to his A, stammered Ruislip, Ruislip. Just imagine how he'd say, well, where do you want to book to? And the voices from behind, must we wait until this gentleman has ascertained his mind? However, come they did, and the population grew from 9,000 in 1921 to 16,000 10 years later, creating the need for more facilities like shops. And this often went hand in hand with house building, as we have seen in Eastcote. Harry Neal Limited, for example, built the shops in Station Approach Green Lane in the mid-20s. Ruislip Shopping Centre developed from two clusters of shops, the main one being by St Martin's Church, and these included Mulder's the Baker, the high-class pastry cook and confectioner, and Crookles the Butcher, where you bought your corned beef and pickled stuff. And of course, one that we are familiar with, Haley's Post Office. There was also a newsagent, a sweet shop, shoe shop, confectioners, dairy, a tailor's, and a grocer's. Now, up to 1925, the High Street ended at Ickenham Road, and beyond it was West End Road, which ran to the station. On the corner to Risip Station was the other cluster, which was a parade of shops, which included Moore's estate agents, together with a greengrocer, fishmongers, newsagents, Craddock's Dairy, and the stationers. Sorry, I'll go back to the stationers just for a second. And then we'll move on to Craddock's Dairy. So with these two clusters of shops, the local newspaper was rather scathing about the High Street, saying that it could hardly be called one at all, and that the name was no more than an ironic nameplate. But it did foresee that in time it would grow into something more tangible. However, one of the first developments was a Roman Catholic church, the Church of the Sacred Heart, which was completed in 1921 on land gifted by Eleanor Warrender, who lived at Highgrove in Eastcote. During 1922 to 3, new tradesmen arrived, a butcher, a greengrocer, and a garage too. And branches of the London County, Westminster and Pars Bank and Barclays Bank were opened. Now, although Harry Neal Limited built the Westminster Bank, the Mr. Ruislip of the 20s was Arthur Prouting, who incidentally built the Church of the Sacred Heart. He was an astute businessman who purchased virtually the whole of the frontage on the east side of West End Road down to the station for the princely sum of 45 shillings per frontage foot. He then got himself elected a member of the UDC, and then he persuaded the council to change the name of that part of West End Road to the High Road, which not only lengthened it, but increased the value of the area too. 1923 saw several changes. Basil Fab's restaurant, which could accommodate 100 people, was opened. But on the other hand, another catering business passed into history. The Poplar's Tea Rooms, run by George Whedon of King's End Farm, had operated for 15 years and catered for huge parties of school children and adults. Many of them came from London on special trains during the summer months, and he often had 40,000 visitors each year. Even though new building was taking place, the condition of the High Street hadn't improved much by the mid-20s. It was seen by the local paper as a dreary and depressing place, and in a wretched condition, especially in wet weather, when the pathways, which only existed in places, were ignored by pedestrians who preferred to walk in the road. Eventually, a scheme was adopted whereby footways in front of the shops were widened and straightened out, making the transition to an urban setting more pronounced. Trees were cut down at the corner of Ickenham Road, opposite the poplars, and high fences around Park House were taken down, thereby opening up a clear view of the street. The local paper commented that the quaint and beautiful old world village street will quickly become a thing of the past, for new modern buildings are being erected on vacant plots along the new frontage, and the only old-fashioned thing likely to be left untouched is the ancient village pump, now used today more as an indicator for present-day road users. A new post office built by Proutings opened in August 1927 at a cost of some £10,000, replacing the old facilities in Haley's shop, which could no longer cope with the needs of a rising population. For example, a large rise in telephone subscribers since the end of the First World War had caused problems, and engineers were finding it difficult to fit the new subscribers to the existing switchboard. In 1928, the question of how to locate shops arose. One suggestion was that the individual parades and blocks of shops should be named rather than each shop being given a number. Now, the council ruled against this, and that's why the shops got numbered. Further shops were built between King's End and Ickenham Road, and development also took place at the junction of Ickenham Road itself. The old Poplar site was sold, and new shops were to take its place. And here we have the Risip shopping parade, which was located between King Edward's Road and Ickenham Road, and that's the actual photograph of it. And if you look at the left hand of this picture, you might just be able to pick out the international stores there. And here we have a picture of their staff. And very smart they look too. Well as changes to shopping centres, other facilities were also needed. We've seen that the Church of the Sacred Heart was built in Risip's High Street, which saved a long journey to Uxbridge for Roman Catholics, and other denominations too found the need to have their churches on the spot. Slightly earlier, the Church of England had decided that EASTCOTE would be made its own mission district. 1 acre had been purchased as a site for a new church, and an iron church and club room at St George's Southall had been offered as a temporary church. People at EASTCOTE had to raise the money for its removal and re-erection. It was called St Lawrence and was dedicated in December 1920. There were several developments in Northwood. 2 stone-laying ceremonies took place in 1923 for St Matthew's Roman Catholic Church in Hallowell Road and for a new Wesleyan church in Oakland's Gate. 1926 saw the seating doubled in Holy Trinity Church, located in Rickmansworth Road, and St John's Presbyterian Church, Hallowell Road, built a new hall. Ruislip Methodists started to meet at the Poplars rather than going to Ickenham, but after some 12 months, they were able to achieve their own stone-laying ceremony in April 1923 for a school chapel in Ickenham Road, almost adjoining the Poplars. New schools were needed too, with Manor Senior, now Bishop Ramsey, opening in 1927, and Coteford Infants being opened in 1926 in the Eastcote Village Institute Hall. A new day school was opened in Risip with the arrival of Kelvin House School in 1927. While in 1928, land was secured at Potter Street, Northwood Hills for a new secondary school. New entertainment came to Risip, for the corner of Ickenham Road was chosen as a site for its first cinema, the Rivoli. Some 1,300 people attended the opening performance in October 1929, when the film was an early silent movie directed by Alfred Hitchcock, called, appropriately, Champagne. It's a pity there doesn't seem to be any pictures of the interior of this Grecian-style cinema. It had a stage large enough for variety turns and an area for an orchestra. On either side of the seating were organ pipes. It had an auditorium and a balcony, and the seats were in blue. And keeping to the theme of entertainment, it's worth mentioning that 4 years earlier, Northwood Hall had been purchased by Alfred Denville, who lived at Southport, as a retirement home for actors. And if you're interested in watching the opening ceremony of Denville Hall, if you go onto the Pathé News website, you can call it up and have a look. Unfortunately, it's silent, but nevertheless, you can see what was going on. Excuse me a minute. Now, many newcomers to the area just after the war would have been aware of how other areas were being modernized, and they naturally expected to see similar developments here. Some of the conditions they found can be summed up in a piece of verse printed in a local paper in 1919 under the title, "The Mud Larks at Ruislip," and it goes as follows. We came to Ruislip's rural lanes from busy London town. We bought our houses with our gains, and now we feel quite down. The reason why is thick, not clear. It lies about in lakes, and when the sun shines freer, it simply dries and bakes. And still the mud is deep, mixed with rain and sleet, while motor lorries sweep all Ruislip off their feet. The clay subsoil, it smiles, and with a muddy frown says, "'Twill be a longish while before they keep me down." Oh, it's mud, mud, mud on roads that are dud. The road board says the blame is the council's. Fie for shame. So it's mud, mud, mud. Well, the formation of the Ruislip and Eastcote Association in 1919 allowed the community to press for improvement and to seek to conserve the best of the old. In its early years, however, much of its time was given over to social and cultural activities, for there were very few other organisations equipped to provide suitable entertainment. Indeed, the Ruislip Operatic Society started life as part of the association. The lack of street lighting and the destruction of trees caused much controversy, and the association played its part in pushing for the first and trying to conserve the second. In 1924, a new resident wrote to the local newspaper, "Surely we are not to experience yet another winter of darkness and mud. We need lighting, naming of roads, and better footpaths. It's ridiculous to say that a few gas or electric standards would spoil the look of the place. Nothing is done to stop the wholesale felling of the beautiful old trees which are the beauty of Ruislip and which can never be replaced. Let's keep those by all means." Now, the debate about the need for street lighting went on for years. At one time, the council decided that lamps in Northwood should be lit for 9 months of the year, while it was only necessary for Risip and Eastcote to be lit for 8 months. But I'm not sure if much had been installed by the time the 20s ended. A public meeting was held at Fabs Hall in January 1927 to protest at the destruction of trees, both in the High Street and more widely. It was accepted that many existing roads couldn't cope with the growth in road traffic and that widening had to take place. But the residents questioned whether the council were taking due care in ensuring that trees couldn't be retained before they were felled. And the meeting urged that when mature trees had to be felled, then new trees should be planted. The association was instrumental too in preserving a small open space in the centre of Risip when it proposed to the council that land adjacent to St Martin's Church should be acquired as a recreation ground. Churchfield Gardens was almost 5 acres when it was officially opened on the 8th of June 1929, sporting tennis courts, a playground and a shelter. The opening was a grand affair, with schools, children singing part songs and performing country dancing. There was Morris dancing and music from the RAF band. This figure and fountain stood at the entrance, but unfortunately didn't survive very long. It's thought that some sensitive person or people thought it improper and removed it. Now those who know the gardens can still see the circular base, in which are now planted roses. Shortly after the opening of Churchfield Gardens, Hastehill Golf Course, which covered some 60 acres, was the next open space to be added to the area. And speaking at the opening, the chairman of the UDC said 2 cheers that the council were great believers in providing open spaces for people to enjoy, and he was proud that they were creating a chain of open spaces extending from Northwood to Ruislip and Eastcote. Many of the newcomers to the area would have done so as a result of development by the Metropolitan Railway Company and its fast railway service, which promised to live in the country, work in the town life. So inevitably, the association put a lot of effort into trying to improve the lot of the commuter. In 1928, the Met launched an advertising campaign which promoted Ruislip and which aimed to sell land for building plots, and they used the slogan, "Get joy out of living in Ruislip," and they issued a booklet called Ruislip, London's Healthiest Suburb. Well, the way the Met did this advertising rather appalled the association, and in retaliation, they forcibly argued that the company would do an awful lot better if they just improved their rail service. They called for an overhaul of the services on the Uxbridge line with better, cheaper and quicker trains. During rush hour, they said, because of the sparsity of trains, travelling was a torture, and the intermediate service to Rayners Lane in the winter was a nightmare. That windswept derelict station, Rayners Lane, where frozen passengers shivered within a fraction of a mile of the boundary of Ruislip, needed modernising. I seem to remember doing that too. And lastly, and it's something close to the heart of our society, the association recognised the necessity of taking steps to preserve ancient buildings and other interesting features of Ruislip, and I think we should be very grateful that they were so far sighted that early in the century. Well, I hope I've said enough to indicate that Ruislip wasn't so much of a sleepy little village in the 1920s, for quite a lot was going on, and that if nothing else, it was certainly waking from its slumbers. And although it's not an exact match for the decade, a look at our 1916 map compared to the, sorry, that should have been the previous slide. And although it's not an exact match for the decade, a look at our 1916 map compared to the next available, which is for 1935, sorry about that, shows the massive growth that Risip experienced between these years. And I feel that the 1920s lay the foundation for this. So I hope that you may agree that the 1920s were an important period in the history of Ruislip and district, and that perhaps it does deserve to be a little bit more remembered than maybe it is. For it has given us landmarks of memorials, housing, shopping centres, churches, and open spaces which are so familiar to us today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. That's an amazing tour of, as you say, a little appreciated decade for Ruislip, and so much was happening during that period. You've assembled so many different aspects of the history of Ruislip, socially and building projects, and the remnants of earlier periods and what was still there in the 1920s. So I found that fascinating. Thank you very much. I reckon there may well be some questions. So if anyone would like to ask Philip questions about Ruislip in the 1920s, please feel free to either unmute yourself and speak, or you can write something in the chat window, which you'll find roughly in the middle near the bottom of your screen. Ignore the text in there that Melanie has put. That's to do with a quiz which is coming up, but do write something in the chat window or unmute yourself and speak if you'd like to ask Philip anything.
I'll stay.
And I'll switch your screen off, shall I, Philip?
Oh, yes, please, if you will.
So we can see your full screen. Right. Was there someone wanting to ask something then? I thought I heard someone. Any questions for Philip, who's obviously done an immense amount of research into that period? So I'm guessing you're definitely the society's expert, possibly the nation's expert on Ruislip in the 1920s.
Wouldn't have thought so.
So your chance.
There's lots of interesting things that went on in the 20s which I can mention. One thing was, I haven't mentioned Ruislip Lido, for example. Now, the reservoir, they discovered an aerial bomb in the mid-20s, which they thought might have been dropped from a Zeppelin. And in 1929, the reservoir was used for, I think it was the British Ice Skating Championships. And the reservoir itself was one of the major places where people went to skate during the winter months. So that I found quite interesting. Number of other things as well. The period of the general strike was quite interesting. Police turned up in force at the stations in Northwood to guard the stations, and all sorts of happenings like that were going on.
Jane, you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to ask anything?
Yes. Well, I'm sitting in a house built in 1922 by Mr. Prouting in Manor Road, and I'm interested in knowing exactly when the Oaks, at the end of Manor Road, where Manor Road joins onto the High Street, was originally a little narrow lane beside the Park Estate. When was that actually adopted and turned into a road that the cars drove along?
That's a very good question, which I can't possibly answer, I'm afraid. We'll try and look it up for you.
Yes, one could look up in street directories and things to see when the houses were first occupied. There's another question.
We talked about street directories. I think there are 4 street directories for Risip which cover the 20s period, early, late, and in the middle. So you may be able to find out from that.
So we could quite easily find out. Another question for you, Philip, in the chat window. Where exactly is the memorial to George Honey located that you showed a photo of?
Northwood Cemetery.
Right. Okay, thanks. Right. Any further questions for Philip? Right. Well, it looks as though you've answered pretty well everything, Philip, and given us a lot more information besides in your additional points just now. So I'll say thank you very much again. I will give you some applause on my screen and some real applause as well to mimic what you'd get in the real meeting had you been able to address us fully.